So in this video, we're going to be looking at probably the most fundamental concept in programming, that of the variable. Now we've already seen a few variables before, and in fact there's one on the screen right here. So in Swift, we usually define a variable with the keyword var, and then we give a variable name, and usually we set the value equal to whatever we want that variable to be. So variables in programming are just the same as when you were doing algebra at school and trying to work out what x was. Except in programming, usually we know the value of our variables and we use them to manage, say, the score on our game, the username on our social networking app, or the content of an email that we want to display. So first off, let's remind ourselves of the two ways that we can define a variable in Swift, which we saw in the previous section. The first, as we've got there, is var, and the other, you may remember, is let. So I might have a variable that I'm going to call other str, which I'll define as hi Rob. So both of these are similar variables. The major difference is that with str I can change its value. So if I say str equals hi playground, then that's fine, because this has been defined with a var. And there you go, you can see that the value's updated there. If I try and update the value of other string though, or other str, to say hi Kirsten, then we get an error, because other string has been defined by let. And it's suggesting here that we fix that by changing it to var. But I'm just going to get rid of that change there. So I'm going to add a little comment there. Other str cannot be changed. So we'll start off, as I say, by looking at the difference between var and let. Then we're going to look at some different variable types. And we're going to start with strings. So most of the variables that we've looked at so far have been strings. You can tell a string generally because it's usually surrounded by double quotes, like that one there. And essentially a string is a collection of characters. So it can contain numbers, letters, punctuation, anything. So here's a very quick challenge for you. Can you create a variable called name and then set it equal to whatever your name is? Go for it. Did you manage it? I'm going to use let because we're not going to change this variable, and then just set it equal to Rob, like that. It's worth getting into the habit of using let for variables that you don't intend to change. Okay. The one other thing I want to show you with strings right now is how we can combine them or concatenate them. So let's say, for example, I wanted to print hello and then the name. What I would do is use the print command and then hello with a space and then plus and then the variable name. So in this case, name. Just like that. And this plus will then combine these two strings. So we've got the hello string with a space at the end, and then we've got the variable called name, which we know is equal to Rob. And there we go. You can see those two strings have been combined into a single one. All right, so far so good. So now let's see a second variable type, and this is actually one that we've seen before. It's the integer, which is just a whole number. So to create an integer, we use let, or we can use var as well if we're going to change that integer at some point. I'm going to call it myInt, and we just set that equal to something like 8. Any whole number will do there. And then, because this is an integer, we can do all sorts of sums on this integer that we couldn't do on strings. So if we want to double our integer, for example, we could use myInt asterisk, which is what we use for multiply, and then times 2. And that will then print 8 times 2, or hopefully 16. There we go. So, super quick challenge for you. Can you print the value of myInt plus 100? Simple as that. Go for it. Okay. Hopefully you did something like myInt plus 100. That should give us our 108. We can even update the value of myInt as long as we've defined it as a var rather than a let. So if we wanted to add 1 to it, for example, we could use myInt is equal to myInt plus 1. And that will then add 1 to the value of myInt, and myInt will now be 9. There we go. Notice though what happens if we try and do something like myInt is equal to myInt divided by 5. And that gives us the value 1, which is not exactly 8 divided by 5. But remember, myInt was defined as an integer, a whole number, so it can't be a fraction. So it will always round down. So if you've got a number that you think may not remain an integer, you should not define it as an integer. You should use a different variable type, which we'll see in a moment. But just before we do, let's see a quick and easy way that we can put integers into strings using Swift. So if, for example, we wanted to print something like myInt has value, and then put the value of myInt into that string, we just use a backslash and a pair of parentheses, like that, and then put myInt inside the parentheses. And we can use that for integers or a number of other types of variables to include them in strings. So now you can see myInt has value 1. All right, quick challenge for you then. I want you to create a variable called age and set it equal to your age. And then using that variable and the variable name that we created before, I want you to print something like my name is, and then your name, and I am, then your age, years old. So I want you to print that to the console by using variables for your name and your age. Go for it. All right, hope you managed that. Should have been fairly straightforward. So I'm going to set my variable age to be equal to 35. If you use var there, then that's fine, but age, at least in the scope of this particular bit of code, is not going to change, so we should really use let. And then we're just going to print my name is, and then I want to include name, so I'm going to use plus name, just like we did up here, to concatenate or combine our strings. And then another string, and I am backslash pair of parentheses and age, years old. There we go. Let's take a look, see if that worked. Oh, I think I might just want another space there. Otherwise, my name and are going to come a bit too close together. And there we go. My name is Rob and I'm 35 years old. Worth just quickly noting that we can use this method to include strings inside strings if we want to. So we can use backslash name to include name inside the string, and that works fine as well. And there we go. Alright, so we're now reasonably familiar with integers and strings. There are a couple of other variable types that I'd like to show you before we move on to arrays. And the first is a double, which is essentially a decimal. So you'll remember when we tried to divide 9 by 5, it rounded it down to 1. That's because my int is an integer and so can only have whole number values, so it's always rounded down to the nearest value. But quite often we're going to want to store non-whole number values, and for those we use what are known as doubles. So to create a double, we just take a variable name, let's call this one A, and then set it to whatever we want. So 8.73, for example, and that will automatically create a decimal for us. We can also specify the type of variable if we want to. We can actually do that with any of these variables by putting a colon after the variable name and then making it clear what type of variable that we want. So a double is a, as it says there, double precision floating point type value. It's called a double because there's another type of variable, essentially a floating point number or a float, and we can use that type as well to store decimals. Doubles are more commonly used in Swift and iOS development in general, so I'd recommend sticking with those, but it really doesn't matter, at least at this stage, which you use. And if you want to, you can just leave the definition off and let Swift decide what type to use. So once you've got these, of course, you can now do any calculation you want. So if we wanted to do A divided by C, for example, then we could do that and we'd get a full value. As you can see, we've got a very long decimal expansion there. So a double won't be stored to full accuracy, but it'll probably be as many decimal places as you need. Notice that if we try and combine a double and a float, then we'll have problems. So if we do print A divided by B, for example, that won't work because we can only divide or indeed add or multiply variables of the same type. Notice also that that means that C is therefore a double. So if you don't specify what type of variable you've got, but you set it equal to a decimal, then by default it will be set to a double. So A divided by B won't work, as you can't combine two different types. Similarly, you can't do one of our integers and add a double to it. That won't work either because you can't combine an integer and a double. So I'll just comment that out as well. You can, however, convert an integer to a double. So if we wanted to do my int plus a, we could do it, but we just have to convert my int to a double, which we do by using the double with a capital int method, which then converts the integer to a double, makes it 1.0 essentially, and then adds a to it, and you can see we get 9.73 as a result. And we can actually use any of these to attempt to convert one to the other. So we can use string to convert an integer to a string. We can use int to convert a double to an integer, etc., etc. And then we can obviously combine all of these doubles in any way. We can multiply them, add them, subtract them, just as we did with an integer over here. All right, so that's doubles and floats. There's one more type I'd like to show you before we move on, and that is the Boolean. Now, this oddly named variable is essentially a variable that can be true or false. So we might have a variable called game over, for example, and initially it might be false, and then when the user dies or runs out of lives or whatever, then that could become true to show that the game over has taken place. Booleans, if you're interested, are named after George Boole, an English mathematician who came up with a lot of the mathematical logic that we use today, specifically Boolean algebra, which is based around true and false concepts. So obviously we can't combine booleans with any of these integers, but we can convert them to strings. So if we had a game over string, for example, we could use the string method to convert game over to a string, and then game over string would have literally the word false stored within it. Okay, so that's as far as we're going to go with variables for now. This is really all the core variable types that we'll use in the course. I'm going to give you a challenge to put it all together. So I'd like you to create two numbers. So two variables. One of them should be a double. And I'd like you to set the double to 5.76. And I'd like you to set an integer to 8. And then I'd like you to print the product of 5.76 and 8 is, and then whatever it is. And I'd like all of these to be created by variables. So the variables that you've used over when you created the double and the integer. So create a double equal to 5.76, an integer equal to 8, and then print the product of the two numbers is, and then work out whatever it is directly in the print statement. Best of luck. Go for it. Okay. Hope you managed it. It doesn't really matter whether you use var or let, but extra points if you use let, because we're not going to be editing or changing these variables. So let is the best choice. So we've already used A, B, and C. So let's use D to create our 5.76. And this, of course, will be a double by default, as we noticed earlier, but you're very welcome to specify that it's a double as well if you want to. So either way round there would get you full marks. We'll also create our integer. So E, which is equal to 8. And again, you can specify that it should be an int if you want, but you don't need to because it would be an integer anyway, because you're setting the value to 8. And then finally, we're going to print the product of, and we'll get the 5.76 by using backslash and then brackets D, and backslash and brackets E for the integer. And we'll set that equal to, and we might attempt something like D star E for D multiplied by E, but of course that will give us an error because E is an integer and D is a double. So the easiest way around that is to convert E to a double using the double command there. And then we've got what we wanted. The product of 5.76 and 8 is 46.08. There we go. Hope you managed that. That's a fairly thorough primer on the different variable types that you'll need in iOS development and in this course. In the next video, we're going to go on and look at another fundamental variable type, the array.